Hey guys, welcome to this week's FAQ and Freebie Friday. Now before we begin, if you're new to our channel, these videos are all about answering your health related questions. So if you have a question concerning your health, something regarding health in general, diet, nutrition, herbalism, Chinese medicine, supplements, or really anything related to health and wellness, and you would like our help in answering your questions, all you have to do is leave those questions in the comment section below, and we'll be answering those based on popularity, the questions that we feel are going to be the most beneficial to the community as a whole, and of course the questions that we are capable of answering. Something else really great about these videos is that every week from that comment section, we select one lucky person to win a free bag of tonic herbs or medicinal mushrooms. So even if you don't have a health question for us this week, but you're interested in winning some free herbs, all you have to do to be entered to win is simply subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't yet already, give this video a thumbs up, and then just drop any comment in the comment section below. And with all that being said, let's get to this week's questions. All right, so getting to our first question. This is a popular question, but something we haven't covered yet in any of the FAQs, and it's a topic that we sort of sporadically talk about in various YouTube videos on the YouTube channel, but I figured I'd go ahead and answer it since it is such a popular question. And that question is, can you please do a video on which foods can have a negative effect on estrogen? I've been doing some research and there is conflicting information. So to answer your question, yes, I will make a very in-depth video in the future on all of the foods that have a negative effect on estrogen, and that negative effect would be increasing estrogen. Estrogen is something that we want to keep in balance. We generally want only a small amount of the estrogen really for normal and healthy bodily functions. Too much of it can lead to a whole host of issues. And we talk about all of the negative effects on estrogen in almost every video that we make because it is a stress substance. All sorts of stressors increase estrogen and the various stress chemicals in the body, and ultimately stress is what leads to resistance, pain, discomfort, and disease. So almost every health condition that you could think of is rooted in stress. When the body is healthy and well, it is ultimately the absence of this stress and resistance, and it's ultimately a state, as my mentor puts, of effortless, resistantless communication with the body, the self, and ultimately the whole universe. So if your body's cells are not communicating efficiently with one another and the various endless chemicals and substances inside of it, you can experience disease. And estrogen, hands down, is one of the major substances that disrupts cellular communication and cellular function. So in that way, it definitely contributes to a whole host of disease. But again, there are so many mechanisms behind estrogen's negative effects on the body that again, we cover so often on these videos, so I won't go too much into that and instead focus on your question about some of the specific foods that increase estrogen that you're going to want to avoid. So keep in mind that this is something that we cover very, very in depth in all of our online courses, especially the Healthy Weight Loss course and the Forever Healthy Hair course. I go into depth about the various foods and their estrogenic effects, and I cover things that I might not be able to recall off the top of my head when I answer your question here in a moment. So definitely I recommend those courses as a resource for everybody. The reason I made those courses, other than people asking me to make courses on these topics, is because they're such popular health concerns for people, and they're basically covering all of the frequently asked questions over the last 4 years and refining them and putting all of that information into one place, so that way you have all of it all of the time in the most refined and detailed sense. Because again, there's always things that I miss when I'm making these videos because there's just so much to talk about. But getting back to your question, first, you're right in that there's tons of conflicting information and research. In fact, in my own research, one of the most interesting things, I think it's almost funny, is how the internet is full of opposite research. So backwards physiology, backwards science. It's so amazing to me how funded research has got to the point where people are literally reading how they should be increasing estrogen and consuming things like polyunsaturated fats, and that you should be consuming tons of canola oil and corn oil for good heart health. And it's literally not only written on the internet in various places, but there's actual science behind it that's backing these claims, and it's just so backwards. And to not get too controversial and conspiracy sounding, but the fact of the matter is a lot of these conflicting studies and conflicting information is outright misinformation from funded research ultimately from the estrogen industries and industries like Monsanto and Big Pharma. So I recently saw something really interesting, a statistic that Big Pharma spends more money on marketing, significantly more money on marketing than they do research. So that just goes to show you, people always prove what they're not. If you're spending more time trying to prove your point than you are just looking at objective facts, then something's wrong there. Something's not entirely pure in their intentions. So that's the truth of the matter. There's so much conflicting information because these multi-billion-dollar industries want us to think that these things are health promoting and they can get away with it. Unfortunately, I think it's incredibly unethical, dishonest, and evil. But the truth of the matter is, from the early 1900s, estrogen was considered the hormone of shock and stress. It was early on considered a stressful substance, and that information in science got manipulated way down the line, and now it's considered the female hormone and it's necessary for everything female, when that's just not entirely true. Yes, women do have more estrogen than males, but even in the female body, in order for it to be healthy, the female body has to be producing about 50 to 100 times more progesterone to estrogen in the body. So that just goes to show you that although there's more estrogen being produced in the female body, it is still tightly regulated by androgen hormones. And if we look at some of the major foods that increase estrogen, interestingly enough, not only are a lot of these foods estrogenic in of themselves, containing estrogen mimicking substances or chemical-like estrogen substances in them, but it's interesting that a lot of these foods also impair the body's ability to produce the more protective hormones. So a lot of these foods, soy being one of the most estrogenic substances, hops and cannabis, these foods are known to cause fertility issues, yet they're increasing estrogen. And the most important hormones for healthy fertility levels are progesterone and testosterone. So this just goes to show you that even in a female body, in order to be optimally fertile, you need a significant amount of progesterone, again, 50 to 100 times more than estrogen. And estrogen is not usually deficient in women with PCOS and fertility issues. They're usually deficient actually in the other sex steroids, progesterone and testosterone. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of the confusion around all of the conflicting information. It's ultimately just due to biased and funded research with an ill intent to just sell people on things like estrogen hormonal replacement therapies, birth control pills, and also to tightly cover up the connection between the polyunsaturated fats, things like soy, corn, vegetable oils, Monsanto, and estrogen and the estrogenic effects. So I think that's part of the reason there's so much conflicting information and research, because there is a certain level of fraud and conspiracy happening. But getting to your question specifically about the foods, as I mentioned, there are foods that directly contain estrogen chemicals in them. These are phytoestrogens. And then there are foods that not only contain those phytoestrogens, but foods that impair the body's ability to metabolize estrogen, which would cause your body to accumulate it in the body. So of the many, many foods that do have an estrogenic effect, I think the worst of them are foods that contain a high concentration of polyunsaturated fats. So I talk about these all the time, especially in all of our courses. These are things like canola oil, soybean oil, corn oil, various vegetable oils and vegetable blends, peanut oil, safflower, sunflower, and not just the oils, but also their sources. So soybeans in any form, corn, a lot of nuts and seeds in their raw form, as well as various grains and other legumes. So not only do these foods contain phytoestrogens in them, more often than not, they contain isoflavonoids or lignans that mimic estrogen in the body or increase estrogen, but the polyunsaturated fatty acids in of themselves actually have very similar overlapping physiological effects to estrogen. And something else that makes them incredibly estrogenic is that the polyunsaturated fatty acids can block the secretion of the enzymes produced by the liver that metabolize estrogen in the body, so impairing liver function and the liver's ability to destroy estrogen and get it out of the body, which would cause the body to obviously accumulate estrogen. And lastly, as I mentioned previously, these foods also are known to suppress androgen hormone production. A lot of them have an anti-androgen effect, which would just further contribute to the estrogen imbalance. So the thing I would generally recommend is looking up all of the sources of the highly polyunsaturated fatty acid-rich foods and oils and remove the majority of those, if not all of them, from your diet. The second major estrogenic food that you're going to want to look out for is another one that most people don't really consider to be all that estrogenic, but these are going to be your beans and legumes. So not just soy and peanuts, but also various types of beans contain estrogenic properties to them, phytoestrogens, isoflavonoids. Not to mention, a lot of beans, even well-cooked beans, contain goitrogens, which are substances that block the thyroid. And the thyroid hormone is what regulates estrogen. So by containing both phytoestrogens and goitrogens, so I usually recommend avoiding the consumption of beans and legumes, or at least keeping your consumption of them to a minimum. And that leads me to sort of a general tip, which is that any food that disrupts digestive function, causes gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, is ultimately going to lead to increased estrogen levels as well by stimulating a series of pathological events that increase serotonin, cortisol, and ultimately estrogen. So anything that's going to disrupt gut function or impair digestion should also be avoided. And of the many foods that are known to disrupt gut function, beans and legumes are usually at the top. So other than the polyunsaturated fats and oils in the beans and legumes, I would also recommend avoiding the consumption of any sort of grains, which will have polyunsaturated fats in them as well, and also are difficult to digest. But I'm also going to recommend keeping the consumption of nuts and seeds to a minimum, especially seeds like flax, hemp, and chia, which contain a high amount of phytoestrogens or lignans in them. And in addition to that, alcohol is a big one. Not only do the bacteria that produce alcohol produce estradiol or estrogen as a byproduct to make that alcohol, but a lot of alcohols also use estrogenic herbs and fruits to make them. So the skins on grape can actually be estrogenic. It's one of the few estrogenic fruits. And of course, hops is incredibly estrogenic. So in summary, polyunsaturated fatty acids in oils, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, grains, and of course, all sorts of alcohol are going to be things you're going to highly want to avoid. And in addition to those, I would recommend avoiding the consumption of commercial dairy, meat, and eggs, because those animals are usually fed things like corn and soy to fatten them up by slowing thyroid function. So you're going to want to avoid that. But basically, that's just another spin-off of avoiding secondhand feeding of the polyunsaturated fats. All right, so taking a look at our second question, and it reads, thank you. Can you do info on uterine fibroids and how to shrink them through diet, herbs, and supplements? Okay, so a few things that people don't really know about the uterus is that it's strongly connected, obviously, to the entire urinary tract and the kidney system, which is connected to the digestive system. So a lot of the times, issues with the reproductive system are also stemming from not just urinary tract issues and bladder and kidney issues, but digestive issues. This whole region is incredibly interrelated. And a lot of the times, inflammation in the urinary tract, bladder, kidneys is going to be connected to the digestive system, and that is also connected to the reproductive system. So the whole body's connected ultimately, although there are issues that manifest, locally for different people, and people get different symptoms. This usually just traces back to the fact that they had different habitual dietary patterns. So not just types of foods they're eating, but the mannerisms in which they're eating, and also early embedded personality traits and other psychosomatic stressors that could be triggering the different symptoms or the wide variety of unique symptoms. But the fact of the matter is, most health conditions all trace back to very similar hormonal and chemical imbalances and widespread imbalances, like digestive imbalances, for example. So that's one thing to understand, is that the reproductive region is strongly connected to the urinary tract, the bladder, which is connected to the digestive system. And this is probably why Hippocrates said all disease begins within the gut. So I'd highly recommend taking a look at the digestive system, especially when we consider what is a fibroid. So a fibroid is an abnormal, non-cancerous growth. It's basically just scar tissue. And uterine fibroids are obviously just fibrosis that occurs in the uterus. And all fibrosis is strongly preceded by and driven by an excess of serotonin. And our digestive system actually produces over 80 or 90% of the body's serotonin. And although people think that serotonin is deficient in gut issues, serotonin levels usually rise under the influence of gut irritation and inflammation. And it is a precursor or a mediator to inflammation in the development of fibrosis. So in fewer words or simpler terms, fibrosis is preceded by inflammation, and inflammation is usually preceded by or accompanied by high levels of serotonin. So there's tons of research that actually show that lowering serotonin levels systemically can be incredibly beneficial for reversing fibrosis. So a lot of the times people will use anti-serotonin drugs, things like bromocriptine, which is also dopaminergic, and even things like cyproheptadine, which is an antihistamine, anti-serotonin, or just taking a widespread approach to decreasing serotonin levels can actually reverse fibrosis in many cases. So usually anything that lowers serotonin will lower inflammation and then lower or prevent fibrosis. But you can guarantee, whether it's Crohn's disease or intestinal fibrosis, fibrosis of the uterus or any part of the body, that there is preceding inflammation. It is the chronic inflammation or damage to a particular tissue that causes abnormal collagen synthesis and the scarring of that tissue, which is ultimately fibrosis. So fibroids are another term for localized scar tissue development. So the thing that I'm going to recommend in conclusion here is that you take a look at the digestive system, which is usually imbalanced in any sort of fibrotic condition. There's usually a high amount of serotonin being produced as a response to digestive irritation, and this can lead to, again, fibrosis. So I'm going to recommend that you take a look at our Perfect Digestion course for a very holistic, systemic approach to remedying all sorts of digestive issues. I think that no matter what your health goal is, whether you're trying to reduce wrinkles, correct hair loss, correct hypothyroidism, or cure cancer, one of the major goals for all of these things should be to get rid of very basic chronic digestive imbalances. So if you have gas, constipation, bloating, any sort of gut irritation, this is going to lay the foundation for all of these diseases. So learning to get your digestive system into just normal working order is going to be key, and I can't recommend that course enough for just learning the basics and the fundamentals of curing the digestive system of ailments, but just learning how to eat and live in a way that's supportive of good digestive function. As Americans, there are so many things that we learned early on that has been embedded into us, character traits, habitual patterns that are just so counterintuitive of not just good health, but digestive health. So many people, drive in their cars while eating. They eat in panic states. They're obviously making the wrong dietary choices. There's just endless factors, very simple things that people are doing sort of on automatic, almost habitually, that are impairing digestive function. So that course is going to help with all of that. But beyond that, taking a proactive step to lower serotonin is going to be majorly beneficial. So one of the best herbs I'm aware of for lowering serotonin is going to be ginkgo biloba. But you can hop online and just research, various herbs and supplements that lower serotonin. I think the best way to go is to obviously focus on the gut, because if your gut's inflamed and you're taking some sort of anti-serotonin drug or herb, then your body's going to continually produce serotonin no matter what, even if you're trying to take an anti-serotonin substance of some sorts. So that's usually the root of it, where the serotonin is being produced in excess. But other important things for lowering serotonin are going to be avoiding, obviously, the use of things like serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs. One of the major side effects of that could be fibrosis or uterine fibroids, but so many things can ultimately increase serotonin. The precursors to serotonin are tryptophan. So tryptophan-rich foods you should keep to a minimum. So look up all the foods that contain a lot of tryptophan and keep those to a minimum and consume as little of them as possible. And also increase your intake of glycine. Glycine will help to oppose and regulate the imbalances where there's too much tryptophan or methionine. So bringing up your glycine intake, which you really only find in gelatinous animal foods or things like gelatin or collagen, can help to mitigate or balance the excess serotonin in most people's diet. Not to mention, there are really amazing studies that talk about how glycine is anti-fibrotic, can reverse fibrosis even in high amounts. Other anti-fibrotic substances I've come across in studies are going to be things like aspirin, taken on a regular basis. Remember, aspirin depletes the clotting system, which can be restored by taking vitamin K2. So there's really no negative side effects of taking a small amount of aspirin if you're taking a high-quality vitamin K2. And if anything, it's clinically proven to reverse fibrosis, and it actually reverses pretty much every pathological event that causes disease. So I really think there is some merit to the idea that aspirin is a miracle drug. I know it's a pharmaceutical, and I'm personally not a fan of pharmaceuticals, but the research is so interesting. And when you consider the fact that really the only negative side effect is that it can deplete K2 in the body, and you can restore it by supplementing with it, it's something that's at least worth looking into, because, for example, there are studies that show that it's incredibly capable of reversing serious liver fibrosis and can even reverse a cirrhotic liver back into a normal, healthy liver, which is something that's been considered impossible to do. So it's a pretty powerful substance, but other than aspirin, again, you could just look into vitamin K2. And I would highly recommend getting daily adequate sunlight. That is incredibly anti-fibrotic. Adequate sunlight exposure can reverse fibrotic tissue back into normal, coherent tissue in the right amounts. And it's ultimately anti-inflammatory. So anything that's anti-inflammatory will also be anti-fibrotic. But to summarize everything I've said so far, the things you're going to want to do for correcting uterine fibroids is reduce the total or systemic production of serotonin. Your gut produces most of the body's serotonin, and since your gut is so central and so connected to things like the urinary tract, the urinary and kidney bladder system, and the uterus, it makes sense that gut inflammation, high serotonin would lead to that issue. So improving digestive function overall and reducing gut irritation inflammation is also going to be key. You're going to want to learn how to eat in order to do that, so check out the Perfect Digestion course. But some specific foods to take a look at are going to be foods rich in glycine, not consuming foods that are too high in tryptophan, and then you could also look into supplementing with things like glycine in and of itself, or collagen, gelatin, bone broth, taking a look at the research around aspirin for reversing fibrosis, vitamin K2, and daily adequate sunlight. All right, guys, that brings this week's FAQ and Freebie Friday to a close. If you've enjoyed it and found it helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't yet already. And remember, if you're interested in winning some free herbs or mushrooms, all you have to do is follow those cues, give this video a like, subscribe, and leave your comment or question in the comment section below. Otherwise, for additional information and resources, be sure to check out our blog, our online tonic herb shop, and our online wellness academy, all which can be found in the description box below.